This is the second webinar in the 2025 Food Entrepreneurs Winter Webinar Series. And today we're going to be talking about freeze-drying foods safely. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. You can find the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Depending on your device, you may need to hover over the bottom of the screen, click on the chat button, and then the chat side panel will open. Send your message to everybody participating in your webinar, or click the down arrow next to everyone to select a specific participant. And if you need or want closed captions, you can find the CC or show captions button in the bottom of your Zoom window. Depending on your device, you may need to hover over or click that more button with the 3 dots. And then once you find your button, you can toggle the captions on or off. Just a little bit about us, the North Central Food Safety Extension Network. We began with representatives from several states in the North Central region. Since that time, the network has grown to include representatives from all 12 states in the region. And this year we are celebrating 10 years as a group. So really exciting. And all of the universities involved are affirmative action, equal opportunity employers. All extension and outreach programs and materials are open for all without regards to race, color, national origin, sex, gender identity, religion, age, height, weight, disability, political status, belief, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, or veteran status. So let's get started. Again, today we're talking about freeze-drying foods safely. Today's webinar is broken into 2 parts. Part 1 is just a very brief overview of cottage food laws as they pertain specifically to freeze-dried foods. And then the second part is going to talk about the science and safety of freeze-dried foods. So for part 1, it'll be Cindy Bryson from University of Nebraska Extension and myself going through the cottage food laws. And then we will turn it over to Dr. Grace Denau from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who will hopefully answer all your burning questions about freeze-drying cottage foods. Okay, so what are cottage foods? In the most general terms, cottage foods are those foods that are made in a home kitchen and sold directly to consumers. Some states refer to cottage food producers as home-based vendors, but it's this very similar concept. And there are state-specific restrictions on what foods can or cannot be made and sold. So again, the purpose of this part of the webinar is not to go through each state's entire cottage food law. We wouldn't have time for that, but rather we're just going to call out the specific if freeze-dried cottage foods are allowed or not, and if there are restrictions. So what states are we going to cover? Today, we're going to talk about all of those states represented in the North Central Food Safety Extension Network. We sent out a survey to our peers and colleagues across the network and gathered cottage food information from there. So as we go through each state, you are going to notice that there's differences related to specific freeze-dried food requirements. And there are a variety of reasons for these differences, and these may include differences in the overall cottage food law and or the need for different practices for those home-based food vendors. So let's just jump in. So Illinois, the sale of freeze-dried cottage food products is allowed. The restrictions are that the foods must meet the requirements of the cottage foods before being freeze-dried. Indiana, the sale of freeze-dried cottage food products is allowed. There are restrictions limiting to only candies, confections, and fruits smaller than a marble can be freeze-dried. So extension educators reported frequently seeing candies and confections. In Iowa, the sale is also allowed with some restrictions that the food must not need hot or cold holding for safety prior to freeze drying, no milk or milk products, and then no meat food products, poultry or poultry products. And extension educators report seeing freeze-dried candies frequently for sale. In Kansas, the sale is also allowed, and the restriction is if a heat treatment is required prior to freeze drying, it's not allowed as a cottage food. So if that food needed some kind of cooking before for safety, it cannot be freeze dried and sold. So educators report frequently seeing candies. In Michigan, the sale is allowed as well and must meet the requirements of cottage foods before freeze drying. And Michigan has seen freeze dried fruit frequently. And then my state, the sale of freeze dried cottage food products is allowed with restrictions that they must meet those requirements of cottage foods before being freeze dried. So they must be non-potentially hazardous prior to freeze drying. So we've seen candies and whole berries pretty frequently. And then, oh, I'll turn it over to Cindy. Nope, you can take it away, Cindy.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
So for Missouri, the sale of freeze-dried cottage food products is not allowed. They may allow freeze-dried candy or other non-potentially hazardous foods, but it's not a wide exemption. You know, sometimes some counties just allow things and other counties don't. In Nebraska, we are allowed to sell freeze-dried products. That law just changed in July, so no raw eggs, no TCS foods. We can now do anything that doesn't have a vertebrae, no meats. You can freeze-dry produce, you can freeze-dry candy, freeze-dry dairy products, very, very popular and frequently sold are freeze-dried Skittles. In North Dakota, the sale of freeze-dried products is allowed. Nothing uninspected made from meat, nothing uninspected made from poultry unless you met certain exemptions. And what they're seeing sold the most are candies, eggs, and fruit. In Ohio, the sale of freeze-dried cottage foods products is not allowed. In South Dakota, you can sell freeze-dried cottage food products. There are no restrictions. And what they're frequently seen sold are candies and fruit slices. In Wisconsin, they're not allowed to sell freeze-dried products either. So we get a lot of questions as extension educators from food entrepreneurs about freeze drying. Should they be packaged with oxygen absorbers? Does freeze drying change the nutritional value of food? What's the shelf life of freeze dried foods? Are freeze dried foods the same as dehydrated foods? And do all freeze dried foods need to be rehydrated to eat? These are all great questions that we get phone calls on top of the fact, can I freeze dry this? So a lot of misconceptions happen around freeze drying. Um, one of the things that people understand, but is not true, is a myth that freeze drying kills any bacteria that's present, and that is not true. The kill step is not hot enough, and there are other things behind it. At-home freeze drying equipment is the same as equipment used by food processors and manufacturers, and that's not true. And Grace will talk about this. The equipment is not set up to make sure that there's a kill step, and it's very easy for you to dismantle the inside of your freeze dryer and have things not work quite right just by cleaning it. One of the other misconceptions is raw meat that is freeze dried does not need to be handled the same way as fresh meat when it is rehydrated. No, I'm sorry, meat is meat. But these are some common misconceptions that we're seeing. So for support, if you have questions, contact your University Cooperative Extension Service. You can speak to somebody one-on-one, and we can give you some technical assistance. We have training and certification programs. You can call your state or local health like your health department or your regulatory authority, your Department of Ag. Anybody like that, call your local university food science person. So this is just our first part of this. So again, if you have questions, you can get a hold of Amy or myself, and here's our information. And one of the questions that was asked in the beginning was, were these going to be recorded? And these definitely after next week, the recordings will be sent out. So you don't have to worry if you missed something today. So our next webinar is coming up on February 11th. It's a great webinar on sourdough starters, how to care for it, the safety of it, and preservation. It will be from 11 to 12 Central Time. You can register now. It's going to be a great seminar. I would register soon.
All right, are you guys ready for me? Okay,
Yes.
well,
So I introduce Dr. Grace now. She is going to take over, and I think you're going to love her presentation.
thank you, Cindy. You always do this to me. You prime them, and then I feel like I really do have to rise to the challenge. So good morning, everyone. At least it's still morning here in Lincoln, Nebraska. So today we're going to cover, I'm going to cover a little bit about the science and safety of freeze drying foods. As Cindy mentioned, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Food Science and Technology, but I also serve and wear an extension hat. So I'm a specialist in value-added food processing, and I do a lot of my extension work through the Food Processing Center. So I often give consultation and testing services to any kind of food manufacturer, very small to some of the very large ones. I really got involved in freeze drying because we have a lot of raw pet food companies and co-manufacturers in the state of Nebraska. So I work a lot with raw pet foods, another scary topic out there, and high pressure processing. But freeze drying is something that my team has kind of focused on in the last 2 years, kind of added it to our repertoire, if you will. I probably won't have as much time to kind of like give the talk and be watching the chat, but I'm definitely happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. I'm hoping we will have time for some Q&A. But at the same time, if you do have some questions, you can always email me. My email is down below, mdanow2@unl.edu. I go by Grace, so sometimes it's a little bit confusing because my email starts off with an M rather than a G. And the other thing is, since this is going to be recorded, if you don't send me an email, if you want to put it onto the chat, if I don't get to it, I'm also happy to kind of view the recording later and potentially go through the questions, and then I'll just kind of answer them and send them to Amy Johnson and Cindy to share with the attendees. I've also shared a copy of my presentation with them. It's a PDF file. So, and I'm hoping that that could also be shared with the rest of the attendees. So lots of opportunities maybe to interact at the end of the presentation and then also after the presentation, and then for you guys to review the presentation. So with that, let's get started. So one of the things that I wanted to cover was, why are we freeze drying? Like there's so much interest in it. See if I can make this go away first. Okay. So I think overall, the reason why there's a lot of interest in freeze drying is the equipment cost. Freeze drying has been around for so long. We use it a lot in the pharmaceutical space, especially in preservation of vaccines, preservation of live bacteria for different kinds of food microbiology or other biological processes. And certainly, once a company like Harvest hold on, what's the name of their company now? Harvest Fresh, I guess, or Harvest Dry. They figured out how to do it in a maybe cost-effective manner. Cost of the pump is probably the most expensive portion of putting together a freeze dryer, but it's also kind of certainly it's now competing against or very similar to the cost of maybe some of the more premium type of kitchen appliances. So then with that, as some people have already invested in their freeze dryer, there's now a plethora of how-to videos out there, whether or not you're looking at YouTube, TikTok, or other social media platforms. The other thing is we also have quite a huge group of consumers who are very interested in an intense flavor and that texture. So some kind of like a crunch in their food item. And I think that's also because we are a society that snack a lot. So when you think about freeze drying, we're really removing the moisture. So we are concentrating the flavors of the food. And then also by removing the water by sublimation and not necessarily evaporation. So we'll go over this a little bit later. We leave behind some pores or air pockets that give us that very crunchy texture. And then finally, I think, we have more and more people really interested in looking at food as part of their health. So either they think of it as food as medicine or food for health. So there's also just increased demand for minimally processed foods. And, sometimes for some of these more premium food items or formats of foods, yes, they're minimally processed. We're not heat treating it as with high heat as with other formal or traditional processes. So people are willing to also pay a little bit of a premium for their food because they know there's some kind of a function or there's some benefit to eating some minimally processed foods. So I think that's kind of why freeze drying is starting to take off. But if we look at the true definition for freeze drying, one of the words, if you're looking online and in the pharmaceutical space, they would probably refer to freeze drying more as lyophilization. So the two are exactly the same. Those two terms, freeze drying and lyophilization, are pretty much interchangeable. For us working in the food industry or working with food entrepreneurs or food manufacturers, we can think of freeze drying really as a process where we stabilize the food. So we do that first by freezing the food, and then we remove the water or we reduce the amount of water first by sublimation, followed by desorption. So sublimation, if you recall from your general chemistry, is the process of turning ice straight into the gaseous form, so straight to water vapor. And then it's going to be followed by desorption. So that's really trying to remove any bound water that's in the structure of the food material. So and I think usually desorption is done if you do it for a very long time. The goal there is to kind of get something that is bone dry. So very, very small amounts of moisture left behind and very, very low water activities, usually below 0.1. But really, in general, when you freeze dry, the goal at the end of the day is to have a final water activity that will no longer support the growth of mold, yeast, and bacteria. And then there's also some degradative chemical reactions in our foods, such as either Maillard reactions, browning reactions, maybe some of the enzyme activity like polyphenol oxidase that encourages the browning of foods. There's also lipid oxidation or things when foods are starting to go rancid. So those types of reactions typically require a little bit of moisture to kind of get going. So by removing the water through freeze drying, this is another way for us to preserve the food and not allow it to degrade over time. But by and large, whether or not you're freeze drying at home or commercially, this is pretty much a batch process, which is again kind of like lends itself to being a low throughput processing. So you can only do so many at a time because you need to put all your food product into the size or whatever size freeze dryer that you have. And that's the only amount of product that you can process for a given amount of time. And most of the time, the shortest freeze drying processes that I've seen, and these are optimized in the pet food industry, they're usually 12 hours long. In a home freeze dryer, depending on what you're doing and how much water needs to be removed, it can easily be a 12 to maybe even a 24-hour process. So because you can only do so much food, and we call that a low throughput of production in a given amount of time, then this tends to be pretty expensive because the entire time that you're just sitting around waiting for things to be dried down, you're not really making any new product. Perhaps you are preparing some new ones that will go immediately after that, but your production rate is very, very low. So then that tends to be an expensive type of food product. Traditionally, why do people freeze dry foods? Well, they're trying to preserve some kind of a biological activity that is coming from some kind of a heat sensitive compound in a food product. So think about some vitamins, right? So some people may not necessarily want to have a heat pasteurized juice because they feel like the juice is being cooked. So they may choose to, let's say, UV treat. So treat the juice perhaps with ultraviolet rays. So the ultraviolet radiation would then denature or inactivate any bacteria that's found in there, but not necessarily affecting any of the vitamins that would have been cooked down in a situation if you were doing, let's say, heat pasteurization. So that's also a reason why we HPP. So for some reason, perhaps there's a food product where you're trying and going after the vitamins in that particular food product, or perhaps some enzymes that are in that food product. So you don't want to heat that product. So instead, you're looking for a milder heat process. But at the end of the day, you want something shelf stable. So then instead of oven drying this particular food item, then you would freeze dry it. So I think that's one of the more traditional reasons for why we would freeze dry. At the end of the day, the removal of water is also the same as extending the shelf life of a food product. So that allows you to store it in multiple ways. It's up to you. It's almost like a consumer preference. When something is already considered shelf stable, you could choose to go ahead and just refrigerate it. If it's a particular item that you feel that, it's better to consume cold. But certainly because it is shelf stable, by the time it's dried down, then you can store it in your pantry. And then without that moisture in the product, the product becomes very, very light. So that makes foods very portable or easier to transport. So traditionally, astronaut ice cream, right? Like, why would we need to carry excess water weight for the astronauts to go into their capsules to go into space? We would dry that down so that they can still enjoy ice cream, or at least an intense flavor of ice cream as a snack when they're up in space. Certainly a lot of people who go camping, hikers, etc. Again, you don't want to necessarily carry a lot of water weight with you, when perhaps what you can do is carry them in your backpack in dried form. And then when you get to your camping site or where you want to take a break for your hike, then you can also try to, if you have a nice clean water source at that point, then that may be a point where you would hydrate this particular food item. So I'm an engineer by training, and I like graphs like this because I'm also a very visual person. But when we think about freeze drying as a whole, there's many things that are going on. I do feel like it's somewhat a complicated process. So we can always go back to the phase diagram of water. So usually at sea level, we would be experiencing 1 bar or 760 millimeters of mercury of pressure. So this is kind of like the line where we will be. It's kind of, if you can see my blue cursor. And so let's suppose we have some sliced strawberries, or we had whole strawberries. But in order to freeze dry the strawberries, it's best to actually slice them thinly and lay them down on a tray. So we'll slice the strawberries, but this is a very fresh strawberry, so all the moisture that is in there is going to be in liquid form. And we're going to be a little bit away from zero because we're not yet freezing. We're just at room temperature. So we're kind of maybe closer to zero, but not quite as far as, let's say, 100 degrees C. So the first thing that happens in a freeze dryer once you load your strawberries is you put them on a tray, then you put the tray inside the freeze dryer, and then you close the door. And then once you push start, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to notice the temperature come down. And it's going to come down below zero. So then all that liquid water that is in your strawberries is going to be frozen. The freezing step can be done outside of the freeze dryer, and some companies who make freeze dryers, they prefer that you freeze in a regular freezer, perhaps, or a blast freezer, because then this particular step of the process can be shortened. But it's not required for the harvest dry freeze dryers. You can load something that is just fresh and not pre-frozen. But once you've reached the desired temperature, and usually these freeze dryers go all the way down, they can go all the way down to about -30. I believe the Harvest Right freeze dryers, I finally said the name right, Harvest Right, goes down to, I think, between -20 and -30. Then once you reach that temperature, it's going to start to pull a vacuum. So you'll hear your vacuum pump come on, and it's a fairly quick process, maybe within a few minutes, and it will go as low as it can, and it tries to maintain almost zero bars. It's not quite zero. There's always going to be a little bit of atmosphere inside the vessel. And the next thing, though, is once you've achieved those that combined frozen temperature and vacuum level, you're going to start to heat up the trays. So if you have access to a Harvest Right freeze dryer, look under the trays and you'll notice there's a heating pad there. And so it's going to heat up the trays. And what's happening is the shelves heat up, which means the metal trays above it heat up, which means the thinly cut produce or food items that are sitting on top of the trays are also going to heat up. So the moisture then, so in the graph on the phase diagram of water, we're going to go towards the right. So then the moisture then has no choice but to cross this 0 to B curve. And when you cross that, all those solid ice crystals are going to start to just become water vapor. So, and I've kind of noted it here during the sublimation phase. That's really where you're going to get rid of about 90% of the moisture in your product. If it's a well-designed and kind of developed freeze drying process, so a lot of the food processors, the big ones anyway, would go through the trouble of optimizing their sublimation step. They're going to try to get rid of as much as 95% of the moisture during the sublimation step. Then at some point, all that freely available moisture is gone. So you can skip the desorption process. So the desorption process, if you abort the run, perhaps, then it'll just release the vacuum pressure, and then you're way up here again. So if you did your job and you removed about 90% to 95% of the moisture in your food product, there's very small amounts of liquid water that would be in your product at the end of the day. And typically these food items, they dry from the outside in. So all that liquid water would be stuck in the middle. And depending on the structure of your food material, that might actually just migrate and even itself out throughout the food product. But most of the time, a lot of food manufacturers don't want to rely on that. The Harvest Right freeze dryer is designed to have a desorption step for a couple of hours. So it's just going to continue to heat up the trays. And it needs to heat up the trays because any moisture left that needs to be removed is really tightly bound to the structure of the food material. So at some point, and a lot of folks don't really go all the way up to 100 degrees C. Typically, we're only seeing maybe 60 degrees C, or maybe sometimes it's even as low as 120 F, which is the default setting in the Harvest Right dryer. Then once it holds that for a couple of hours, you might get a drop of 1 to 2% in moisture content and almost a negligible drop in water activity. But then you release the vacuum pressure because this unit is going to tell you that it's done. And then when you do that, once again, you cross this curve, the A0 curve, and then you're back into the liquid portion of the phase diagram of water. But again, if you did your job, there should be very little water left that you will actually see in liquid form. So that in a nutshell is how freeze drying works. So it's really a combination of what's the temperature of the food product, what's the temperature of the trays or the shelves that are in there, what's your vacuum pressure, and how long are you doing every single one of these steps. So as you can see, it can be pretty involved if you have to design your own freeze drying quote unquote recipe or how you're going to go about those different stages. So then how does it actually really work for an in-home freeze dryer? So first we need to know the parts of the freeze dryer. So this is a typical Harvest Right freeze dryer. I think this is one of the maybe smaller ones because as you can see, we can see 3 trays onto 3 shelves. The top portion over here does not really support a tray. It's too narrow in that part of the circle. So it's rare for people to put a tray above there. I'm not even sure if that one also has a heating pad. So you have 3 working shelves, if you will, in this particular freeze dryer. Some of them can have as many as 7 trays, and then so the distance between each tray gets smaller and smaller. But this is one that I found online that I thought was a really clear picture, and this one just happens to show 3. So you typically have a plexiglass door, and there's like a rubber gasket that you can allows you to seal that door onto the front of the chamber. The chamber is really just the circular vessel, if you will, within. It's sort of like looking inside of the your oven at home, and I call it a chamber. Then on the top right is a touch screen. So in engineering, we typically call this as your graphical user interface because that's where you're going to program or choose certain settings in your freeze dryer or in your appliance. Then you have shelves, as I mentioned, each one where you see a tray on, there will be a heating pad underneath it. And then the shelves are kind of held together within a particular frame. In the first sets of Harvest Right freeze dryers, it was possible for the user to detach the just kind of like there's this little electrical connection that you can detach the heating pads from the back of the vessel, the chamber, and then you can pull out the entire shelves and then clean it outside of the chamber. The one that I have, I purchased it in 2023, and I think anything purchased from that point forward, you're no longer allowed to remove the shelves. So as Cindy alluded to, this cleaning can be a little bit of a pain because you have to kind of reach in there and try to like wipe down everything. If you're using a sanitizer, you have to be able to apply it to every surface that's back there. So that can be pretty tricky and stuff. But from what I heard from other users who've been using these freeze dryers a lot longer than I have, there was a period of time when people would detach the electrical connection from the heating pad to the back of the unit, and then clean the shelves outside. Once they feel like that's thoroughly clean and dry, they would reinstall it, and then they would reconnect those electrical connections. But then some folks had there were a lot of issues with getting electrical short circuits. So things would spark in the middle of a freeze dryer cycle or freeze drying cycle because as ice is being formed and as moisture is start trying to sublimate inside, you have some bare wires that have an electrical current running through them and they're being exposed to moisture. So I think that's part of the reason I think that they stopped allowing users to mess with the electrical connections inside the chamber. But the trays are going to be where you load your products, and these are the ones that you can kind of pull out and push back in once they're full. And then you have a vacuum pump. The vacuum pump typically has oil in it. So when you purchase these, you'll have oil, and you want to make sure that during venting processes, they'll tell you in the manual how best to vent your product. But what you don't want to do is have some of the sublimated water or the condensed water enter the vacuum pump, because oil and water don't mix, and then that could affect the lifetime of your vacuum pump. I personally, because it's for research at the university, I purchased my Harvest Right using an oil-free pump. But the oil-free pump was $4,000 more than the regular pump. So like these costs quickly add up. But I guess if you were doing it as part of your business, then maybe you could kind of justify the investment into like a $4,000 to $5,000 vacuum pump. On the back of the unit, I'm not showing it here on this slide, there is a valve that the user will use to open to release the vacuum at the end of a freeze drying process. There's also a drain port, and I'll talk about why you need that and why you need to melt down, if you will, or thaw out the condensed ice during a freeze drying cycle. And then a lot of people don't know this, but there's also a USB port to download the data. Again, I use my Harvest Right freeze dryer for research, so I'm very interested in the pressure, the temperature, and the holding times, or how long each stage of the process occurred inside the dryer. But I know for some folks, maybe that's not something that's of interest to them. Harvest Right put it back there because if ever you have trouble and your equipment is not working properly, they'll usually ask you to get a flash drive, stick it in the USB port, download all the data, and then send them that data set so that they can kind of figure out how your Harvest Right has been performing, and then what kind of fix or remedy needs to be done so that kind of they get back to up and running again. So that's at least their purpose for putting one back there. But the manual doesn't explain that you can download the data. We actually had to kind of figure that out for ourselves because, again, we're just a very curious bunch. We're like, oh, you can put a flash drive here. And then a quick call to them saying, what happens if I put a flash drive there? So they start telling you like, oh, okay, you're going to be the people that download the data and try to understand. Okay. And I can share too, like what we found out. If anybody's ever really curious, we can share with you like how to read the CSV file that you get out of the Harvest Right freeze dryer. So overall, the company knows that probably a lot of folks that are going to use their product, their equipment, are not going to be curious people like me, or all people that also kind of want to know the engineering and the processing values, parameters used. So they really market this as something that freeze drying is very easy. If you can press a button, you can freeze dry. So simply press start on the touch screen, and the patented smart freeze technology senses once it's done. So you don't have to program anything. You just literally push start, and then everything is automatic. Okay. Well, I had to figure out, okay, what is this dang smart technology that they're talking about? So I talked to a lot of the larger freeze drying companies, those that work and build commercial units. And from what everybody has agreed, the how Harvest Right is doing this is basically they have some sensors inside the chamber, and then there's some kind of a feedback loop. So they're warming the shelves, which encourages more sublimation. But the more water vapor that enters the chamber, all of a sudden, you're no longer under vacuum conditions. So then it cuts off the electricity to the heating pads so that no more sublimation is happening. And until the condenser, so everything is cold inside the chamber, once that water vapor hits, the inside surfaces of the chamber, it will turn into ice first. So everything that is being removed from your product, all that moisture turns into an ice layer that surrounds the inside surface of the chamber. But then once the sensors notice that, oh, we're back to vacuum conditions, they warm the shelves up again, try to push a lot of the moisture from your product, turns it, and then when there's too much water vapor in the vessel that it no longer holds vacuum, it shuts off the heating pads. So that's really kind of how it works. When you download the data, you'll see a lot of cycling on and off when it comes to the shelf temperatures. So at the end of the day, after you've done your sublimation and you removed about 90 to 95% of the moisture content, it really becomes a choice of whether or not do I continue to go through the desorption process. Because it may not be practical, time is money if it's going to add another couple of hours of operation, but you're really only getting a 1 to 2% reduction in moisture content and barely any movement in the water activity. Perhaps you're done. And then at that point, if you have an idea what the water activity is of your finished product, then you can kind of make an educated or guess or a decision point whether or not your product is already stable. But the harvest right itself is programmed for you to go through a couple more hours of the desorption process. So it just depends on whether or not you're comfortable enough to kind of abort the run and continue on. But really, the best way to kind of decide when a product is done is to do some testing yourself. So I always encourage folks who ask me, what should I do? Should I target a moisture content or water activity? And I would say it has to be water activity because that really determines whether or not we're going to have microbial growth, or also whether or not some of the chemical reactions are still going to push through. So products dry from outside to within. So do a knife test, cut the sample down the middle, check for a wet center, which is also called a melt back. So on the left-hand side, one of my students did a project with raw eggs. We blended it and then we freeze dried it. So these are some of the products, and he had put it inside the Ziploc bag because we were never going to store them for a long period of time. In fact, these are eggs that we had inoculated with some bacteria to kind of understand whether or not is it truly a kill step? Can you ever kill anything inside a freeze dryer? On the right-hand side, he had a run that didn't work out. So like somehow the unit itself aborted itself. And then when he pulled the trays out, he knew that it wasn't done yet because they were feeling a little bit heavy. So when he did his knife test, as you can see, some of the squares, if you will, of the freeze-dried raw eggs actually were very, very dark. So that is a very wet center. So that's what it's going to look like. This is a long set of words, but one of the things that you can do, especially when you're first developing a process to make your product, you weigh your empty trays, load your wet food onto the trays, but make sure that every tray weighs the same and you have an even amount of wet food samples onto the trays, just so that they dry evenly from top tray to the bottom tray. And then you run a freeze drying cycle. When the cycle finishes, pull out each tray and weigh them. But then you can kind of subtract the weight of the empty tray, and any difference from the weight of the wet product per tray minus the dried weight of the dried food products tells you how much water has been removed. So then that kind of, can do some calculations to figure out moisture content. But one of the things that I want you to also do, and I suggest, is to continue to put it back into the freeze dryer. And at this point, the freeze dryer should give you an option to do extra drying time. And the default is 2 hours. So continue to do that. Repeat the weighing and the extra dry cycle times until there's no more change in weight measurements. Because when there's no more weight change, that means there's no more moisture to be removed. And then that gives you an idea of how much moisture was really in the initial product. And then this also assures you that your product is really close to being bone dry. And then maybe if you use the same amounts per cycle that you do afterwards, then you're very consistent in your processing at home. And then just kind of as a rule, a good rule of thumb, you can, once you have your dried products and everything, you have an idea of maybe what the moisture content is. You can always send your samples to a food scientist. You can check with them first whether or not you can send food samples to get a check of your water activity. So I know at the University of Nebraska, we offer that service. So for anybody who wants to contact me, there's a nominal fee to get that done. And really, anything when you have a water activity below 0.6, that means it can no longer support microbial growth. Our water activity of around 0.4, that means the chemical reactions are also going to be minimized. But most freeze drying runs, especially for harvest right, because they've kind of programmed everything for you and they're doing above and beyond on the amount of drying time, you tend to have a water activity below 0 to 0.2. And at that point, there's really a danger of lipid oxidation. So when we have too dry of a product, you can actually get, if your product is exposed to oxygen, you can get it to go rancid fairly quickly. So why would that happen? So one example that I can show here is perhaps mozzarella cheese. So a fresh mozzarella cheese would have this composition at the beginning, but then after freeze drying, when we've reduced the moisture content from 53.4 to 4.3%, then everything else goes up, right? So fat used to be only 20.1% of the total mozzarella cheese. But now that we've removed the water, it's not like we really added fat, we just concentrated it. In fact, we've doubled the amount of fat now in that freeze-dried product. So because it's so concentrated, what used to be perhaps a lower fat item is now a higher fat item, which means it can go rancid much quicker. And then if you look closely, and this is no longer shredded mozzarella, it's a mozzarella stick. If you look closely onto the structure of that food item, you're going to notice a lot of pores. Why is that? So all those little pockets used to be where little ice crystals used to be. So the more pores you have now, means that you've actually also increased the surface area and allowing oxygen to really penetrate and attack every single fat molecule in your food item. So I noticed, and I won't read all of this unless there's real interest for the interest of time. There were a couple of like frequently asked questions that Cindy and Amy had brought up in their presentation. So should freeze-dried foods be packaged with oxygen absorbers? I would say yes, especially if you have a high fat content product. It would just kind of help with mitigating lipid oxidation. Does freeze-drying change the nutritional value of a food item? Yes, as we saw in our freeze-dried mozzarella example, it's actually a way of concentrating the components of the food item when we remove the water. How long is the shelf life of a freeze-dried food? Depends a lot on the food item, but also how well you package it. So if you do everything that you can, have an oxygen absorber, have a packaging material that is very good at blocking moisture, oxygen, and light, you're going to have a pretty long shelf life. Here's another slide that you can read later that kind of compares freeze-dried mangoes on the left-hand side to dehydrated mangoes. They're kind of more like a fruit leather, if you will, on the right-hand side of the slide. So there's some changes, but there's also some differences for sure in how you dry down the product. But at the end of the day, the similarity is freeze-dried foods and dehydrated foods. The goal is to have some shelf-stable products that do not require refrigeration. Question 2 about, do all freeze-dried foods need to be rehydrated to eat? Not necessarily. If the goal is to have a crunchy, intensely flavored snack item, you don't have to rehydrate. And I think this is why a lot of people like freeze-dried candies. Certainly our pets love a lot of freeze-dried liver treats because that livery flavor is what they're after. And then in the next couple slides, I have some data on some of the misconceptions. So freeze drying definitely is not a kill step. As you can see here, some of the reductions that we were able to see with the eggs were about 1 to 2 log reduction. Even if we raise the temperature to 165 F, thinking that we would kill salmonella by then and some of the E. coli. No, we're still under 2 log reduction on the bottom right-hand side. I think one of the things that you should consider here too or look is, our average water activity was 0.05. So these were bone dry raw eggs. The biggest difference between commercial freeze dryers versus the home ones is the big ones are really programmable. I have to tell it exactly what temperatures, what pressure levels, and how long I need to do every stage of the process. Whereas Harvest Right has taken that away from the home user. And final question that I saw was raw meat that is freeze dried does not need to be handled the same way as fresh meat. Not necessarily, fresh meat would have a water activity above 0.9. So that's why it can support the growth of microorganisms. When you dry it down, it swings way to the left. All of a sudden, no more microorganisms and a lot of the chemical reactions are reduced. But once you rehydrate it, you swing right back to the right-hand side again. So even if it doesn't quite rehydrate so that it looks fresh, guess what? The water activity of that product is going to be very high. So you do have to still treat it as if it were a fresh raw meat. Okay, next couple of slides, a lot more words, but I think these are probably something that you already preach to your stakeholders or to your clientele. So best practices for food safety. So practice safe food handling at all times. We can't turn garbage or a contaminated product into a cleaner product inside a freeze dryer. I've already gone over this. Make sure you test for product doneness, both visually doing the knife test and also using a water activity meter. Package dried foods immediately. They're extremely hygroscopic. They'll just suck up all the moisture that's in the nearby environment. Oxygen absorbers will help with high-fat food products. And then, as we mentioned with the raw meats, you treat rehydrated, freeze-dried food items as time temperature control for food safety. And then do your best to clean and sanitize your freeze dryer after every use. I kind of really quickly went over that. We have about 5 minutes for questions, but I also want to let people know I am hosting once again. I do it every 2 years. My high pressure processing and dehydration workshop is during our spring break here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Give you here the QR code and the website. But if you really want to know freeze drying, we have Parker Freeze Dry, a commercial company, giving a couple of presentations and demonstrations. We also have Wenger to talk about dehydrated foods in general, and Hyperbaric and Universal Pure to talk about HPP. With that, I open it up for questions, and I apologize if I really rushed through that.
Grace, this is Karen Fifield, and I'll help you with your questions. So I'll read them. If the desorption step removes a minimal, as I believe is what they're saying, amount of moisture, can that step be skipped and still have safe food?
So yes, you can skip that step. It's not easy in a Harvest Right freeze dryer. You almost have to abort the run. You just say stop, cancel. Then, in order to determine whether or not it's safe, you go through the same steps as I did before, or I mentioned before. You do a knife test, you get it tested for water activity, and so long as you have a water activity below 0.4, it's a stable product. But you have to make sure that the center itself is also been dried out.
Okay. Our next one, I've been told some of the recipes included in the Harvest Right book are questionable. How do we guide consumers?
Oh, that's good. I haven't actually seen the book itself with the recipes because the one that I purchased for the university was a scientific model. So it's one that we can program. But I would be really interested to look and maybe help review the recipes that for those that are maybe purchasing the most basic Harvest Right. But I think in terms of safety, it really depends too on how thick you slice the product. Because if the recipe is calling for a certain size or thickness and you're doing something differently, it's quite possible that yours is drying faster than what the recipe book is saying. But I know a lot of the most basic Harvest Right freeze dryers are not programmable, and you're at the mercy of how well that feedback loop is working.
Okay. The next one, you might want to read your comments because there's some really good and things in there in a little bit. But the
Mhm.
next question I have is the pictures of freeze-dried food have a bland color. Do companies add food coloring or dye to get more vibrant color? And she's thinking I'm of freeze-dried strawberries that are,
Oh, yeah. No, I think it depends on how ripe the strawberries are because I know sometimes maybe earlier in the season they kind of look a little bit greenish or whitish still, depends on where you're getting these. But as far as I know, the commercially produced produce, fruits and vegetables, they never really add anything to it. So it's when those pigments start to concentrate, right? Because there's a little small amount of shrinkage, but as you remove water and if those pigments start to concentrate, then that's when you might see a brighter, deeper color.
Mhm. Okay, great. Do you have more advanced courses? And I have a small commercial kitchen and would like more information. So do you have more classes?
So I have that workshop. In the past, we've recorded the workshop, and I think we're gonna do this again. And then I just posted on UNL Canvas catalog. So you pay to take the course. It's an on-demand course, and you go through all the videos and stuff. So that's one way maybe to get some of that information if you can't attend the workshop in person. But certainly, we're always happy if you want to visit the food processing center and kind of go over your process with you and maybe some of the questions and offer some advice.
Mhm. And I also want to state in the chat, there's some links to and other states that offer the same thing.
Yeah,
So where it depends on where you're at, because for me to go to your university would be a long
so,
drive.
I know.
I would like to try it, but anyways. Okay, so another question I have is I am trying to find an easy way to verify that the food has a low enough water activity for each batch. Is using an infrared um, yeah, thermometer to scan a tray adequate? Theoretically, the food will be warm unless there is an ice left, which would show much colder on the infrared image.
Yeah, so water activity is what really guides us and also the pH on whether or not a food product is going to be safe and stable. So it's just unfortunate that I know a lot of even the cheapest water activity that I purchased a couple years ago was like $4,000 and such. That could be pretty a big investment for somebody who's already purchased a fairly expensive freeze dryer. So again, my suggestion is do the weight test, just a kitchen scale. And then if you are starting to be very consistent in those, right? You're always loading it consistently. When you're unloading, you're always reaching the same kind of weights. Then your process of doing that is consistent. Now get some of that finished items and send it to your university or extension office and see if somebody can help you get the water activity measurement. You can also send it to a private laboratory. So if you want to know which labs can do it, I can send you some recommendations. And then as soon as you get that water activity, you correlate that to the moisture content calculation you have simply from your kitchen scale. And so if you're consistently getting the same weights and moisture content calculations from your kitchen scale, that gives you some assurance that you're meeting that target water activity that you were doing before.
Now, this one was kind of answered in the chat, but it's still a great question for everybody to see. Does National Center approve drying, freeze drying? I'm not sure
Nash
they've tested it. National Center for Home Food Preservation.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So
Yeah.
they have, I'm working with them. They have a graduate student who's going to be presenting at IAFP next summer, and she's doing some experiments and she's different kinds of food items to be freeze dried so that they can provide some guidance on home freeze drying. So, but that's at the I mean, I think she has barely started her experiments or her testing this January. So I'm not sure how much she'll have done by the summer, but the plan is to present what she has so far at the International Association for Food Protection meeting in Cleveland in July.
Awesome. I might have to go to that one.
Yeah. And then I know they're gonna put it in the book or on their website. So at least that's the intent. So I've kind of been working with them, sharing with them what we've been able to do so far.
Okay, so do you know if there are classes on how to rehydrate your freeze-dried foods, such as camping, backpacking meals, things like that?
So that's the part where it's I think the information is very sparse. I've not been able to find a whole lot of guidance in the literature. I mean, okay, every once in a while I do read Reddit, I read the social media stuff. So like some of the things that I'm seeing, which are starting to make sense to me, if let's say if you have a meat like a steak and it's not marbled well enough, so there's not a whole lot of fat in it. So some people feel like they have to add what do you call this, like panko crumbs or breadcrumbs with
Yeah.
it when they freeze dry, because when you start to rehydrate it, it's the breadcrumbs actually that absorb the moisture first. But if they're evenly distributed on the surface of the steak, then the steak itself is more likely to become rehydrated uniformly. Otherwise, there's some weird ways that water would then penetrate the meat. So there's a little bit of that guidance. I mean, it's not scientific, but in my mind, okay, that I can kind of see there's some science explanation behind this, but there's really little guidance in the literature so far.
Okay. And that seems to be all of the, well, I got
Do we have time? Yeah.
well, these guys, yeah. Do you know, that's the one I just did. Here's another one. Okay. They're just making a comment. Small pieces work, large pieces do not work so much. So,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
because they take longer to dry. Yep.
And they need to be consistent in size.
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, I personally want to thank you, Grace, because this was absolutely fabulous. I'm sure that our whole team and all the viewers agree. So thank you for giving us your time to share with us today all of your knowledge, and you will probably hear from a lot of us.
Well, thank you. And I know I rushed through that, but I hope you go through the slides or that they're made available to you and you can kind of, the information provided there a little bit.
Perfect. Thank you.